The void did not whisper, it screamed, but only she could hear it. For 3 centuries, the screams had been her lullaby, her catechism, her one true faith. Kaylin was a scrivener of the Last Testament, and her soul was a reliquary for the final violent memories of a dead species. She sat now in the resonance chamber at the heart of the choir ship Elegy, her body a nexus of gleaming filaments that snaked from the chamber's core and adhered to her temples, her spine, the pale skin over her heart. Around her, 100 other scriveners sat in identical states of communion, their faces slack, their eyes milky and unfocused, all of them conduits for the ghosts of 10 billion dead. This was not a bridge, it was a sanctuary. It was an instrument. Outside the ship's armored hull, the planet Xylos turned, serene and unaware, a pearl of perfect order in the consortium's curated galaxy. Xylos was not a world of cities or people, but of data. It was an archive world, a planet-sized mausoleum where history was not remembered but interred, managed, and, when deemed inconvenient, quietly forgotten. It was the heart of the consortium's great lie, the philosophy of manage forgetting that had allowed them to build a civilization of serene, profitable amnesia. They had forgotten Earth. They had cataloged its death under Extinction Event 734, self-inflicted primitive nuclear exchange, signed the paperwork, and moved on to the next fiscal quarter. The screams in Kaylin's mind told a different story. The filaments grew warm against her skin. She closed her eyes, letting the current pull her under, past her own consciousness, into the great, roiling sea of the echoes. They were not memories in the common sense. They were psychic wounds, the final agony of every man, woman, and child cauterized into the fabric of space-time by the sheer violence of their end. Humanity's last act was not to die, but to leave a scar. The Scriveners had found that scar, and they had learned to make it sing. The fire whispered a billion voices at once, the thought not her own but poured into her. The sky is falling. Kaylin's hands, resting on the cool obsidian arms of her throne, clenched. Her knuckles were white. She was no commander barking orders, no soldier itching for a fight. She was an artist, and her medium was pain. Her purpose was not conquest, but empathy, delivered with the force of a hammer blow. Reese, she subvocalized, her own voice a faint tremor beneath the tidal wave of the dead. Is the choir prepared? The reply came not into her mind, but through a bone conduction implant behind her ear, a deliberate separation he maintained between his duties and her faith. Resonance coils are at 98%. Reese's voice was steady, a rock in her ocean of ghosts. All amplification arrays are green. We are holding stable orbit. Undetected. Reese was a navigator, born in the long silence between worlds, a child of the Exodus fleet. He did not share the echoes as she did. He only saw their effect on her, the way her body would tremble, the blood that would sometimes weep from her eyes after a deep communion. He believed in the mission's necessity but feared its nature. He saw justice. She saw sacrament. They are quiet down there, he added, serene. The consortium database says Xylos has a population of 12,000, all archivists, technicians, curators, not a soldier among them. Kaylin felt a ghost's memory surface, a child in a burning library, reaching for a book as the ceiling collapsed. They burned the stories. The echo whispered, "They are not civilians." Kalen's voice was hollow, resonant with the finality of the dead. "They are the guardians of forgetting. They are the high priests of the lie. There are no innocents in the architecture of erasure." On the surface of Xylos, senior archivist Lyra Venn was finishing her work cycle. Her office was a sterile white cube overlooking a silent server farm that stretched for 100 kilometers, a silent, glowing forest of light. Her job was to redact cosmic history. Today's task was sanitizing the records of the Cathar uplifting, a messy affair where a promising client species had been given technology too quickly and had promptly annihilated themselves. The official record would read, "Societal collapse due to internal instabilities." The truth that a consortium weapons manufacturer had sold them the arms that did it was being carefully, methodically excised from every known database. It was peaceful, meticulous work. She took a sip of her nutrient paste, flavorless and efficient, and looked out at the perfectly ordered landscape. She felt a faint tremor, not in the ground, but in her skull. A low hum, like a distant engine, vibrated behind her eyes. She checked her console. No seismic activity. No atmospheric alerts. The hum grew, resolving itself into something like music. A discordant, multi-layered drone that seemed to pull at the edges of her thoughts. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like wind through the server stacks. A voice, 100 voices, 1,000,000. Lyra dropped her stylus. The whispers were in her head, and they were speaking a language she had never heard but understood perfectly. A language of pure terror. "It's so hot. I can't breathe." "Where is my mother?" Lyra stood up, stumbling back from her console. The serene white office was suddenly filled with the smell of smoke. The hum intensified into a roar, a cacophony of raw, undiluted agony. Across the server farm, lights began to flicker and die. In the central nexus, other archivists were staggering out of their cubicles, clutching their heads. One man began screaming, clawing at his own face, his nails digging deep furrows into his skin. He saw not his office, but a crumbling bunker, the air thick with radioactive dust. A woman collapsed, curling into a fetal position, sobbing for a child she'd never had. Lyra fell to her knees. The white walls of her office melted away, replaced by a sky of churning fire and black rain. The polished floor became cracked pavement littered with charred bodies. The scream of a falling missile tore through her mind, and she threw her arms over her head, bracing for an impact that had already happened centuries ago, light years away. She was no longer Lyra Venn, archivist. She was a soldier on a broken barricade, a father trapped in a burning skyscraper, a child suffocating in the dark. She was dying. They were all dying aboard the Elegy. Kalen's body arched in the resonance throne. A silent scream locked in her throat. The full, unshielded force of the echoes poured through her, a supernova of despair. This was the cacophony. It was not a weapon that killed the body. It killed the self. It drowned the present in the trauma of the past. It did not break hulls. It shattered minds, leaving behind nothing but gibbering husks who had witnessed the end of a world through 10 billion different eyes. Kalen Reese's voice was sharp, laced with alarm, cutting through the storm in her head. Psionic blowback is critical. The field is destabilizing. You have to pull back. She could feel it. The raw chaos of the echoes threatening to overwhelm the ship's containment fields. The ghosts did not want to be channeled. They wanted to be free. Let us in. They screamed. Make them feel it all, with a will forged in 3 centuries of vicarious death. Kaelin wrestled the torrent of agony back under her control. She was the scrivener. She was the vessel. The choir would sing to her rhythm. Slowly, painfully, she attenuated the psychic blast, focusing it, shaping it from a blunt instrument of terror into a surgical tool of revelation. She held the final note, a sustained chord of planetary grief, letting it hang in the minds of the survivors for a long, terrible moment before cutting the connection. Silence. The filaments detached from her skin with a soft hiss, leaving angry red marks. Kaelin slumped in her throne, gasping, sweat and tears mingling on her face. The resonance chamber was quiet again, save for the low hum of the ship's life support and the ragged breathing of 100 exhausted scriveners. "Status," she managed to say, her throat raw. Reese's voice was strained. "Consortium long-range sensors on Xylos have gone dark. All planetary communications ceased 12 minutes ago. We're picking up thousands of emergency medical transponders, but nothing else. No security alerts, no fleet response, just panic." He paused. "Kaelin, what did we just do to them? We made them remember," she said, her voice regaining its strength, its cold certainty. "We gave them the truth. 2,000 light-years away. On the capital world of Consortium Prime." Prefect Valerius watched the reports from Xylos with an unnerving calm. He stood in the Panopticon, a circular chamber where data from across their corporate empire flowed in serene, holographic rivers. He was a tall, ascetic man whose face seemed incapable of expression. He did not see the fragmented, terrified reports of madness and suicide. He saw a data anomaly. He saw an infection. "Isolate the sector," he said. His voice as calm as still water. "Quarantine all traffic in or out. No transmissions. No rescue craft. Burn the data relay satellites servicing that system. I want Xylos to become a ghost in its own archive." An aide, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, hesitated. "Sir, there are 12,000 personnel on that world. They're alive." "No," Valerius corrected her, his gaze never leaving the red flag data stream that was Xylos. "They are compromised. They have been exposed to a hostile memetic agent, a weaponized memory. You do not rescue plague victims. You cauterize the wound to save the body." He turned, his dark eyes finally settling on his staff. There was no malice in them, only a chilling, absolute logic. For centuries, the Consortium has maintained peace and prosperity through a simple, effective principle: the past is a liability. It is a weight that drags civilizations back into the gravity well of their own ancient hatreds and failures. We do not ignore the past. We manage it. We prune it, like a dead branch from a healthy tree. He gestured to the silent, screaming data from Xylos. "This is what happens when the past is allowed to fester. This is a disease of remembrance. Find its source. Analyze the weapon, but do not engage it. I do not want our fleets driven mad. I want to know who is broadcasting this plague of ghosts. And when we find them, we will not fight them as warriors. We will treat them as a contagion. We will sterilize them." Back on the Elegy, Reese stood in the resonance chamber doorway, watching Kaelin as she slowly, deliberately cleaned the contact points on her skin where the filaments had been. Her movements were ritualistic. precise. "They're calling us memory terrorists," he said, holding a data slate with Valerius's quarantined communication on it. "They're sealing off the entire sector." "Let them," Kalen said, not looking at him. "A name is not a judgment. It is a mask they wear to hide their fear. They are afraid of a truth they cannot bury." "And the 12,000 people on that world," Reese pressed, his voice tight. "The archivists. The technicians, are they just collateral damage in your sacrament?" Kalen finally stopped and turned to him. Her eyes, usually a pale gray, seemed darker now. Deeper, as if she were looking at him from the far side of a tomb. "There is no such thing as collateral damage, Reese. There is only the testimony, and those who refuse to hear it. We did not kill them. We simply forced them to listen to the last words of our ancestors. Their minds broke because their civilization is built on a foundation of silence. A structure built on a lie cannot bear the weight of truth." She stood and walked toward the chamber's central dais, where a holographic map of the galaxy shimmered. The echoes were quiet now, a faint, sorrowful hum in the back of her mind. But they were not sated. They stirred, hungry. They guided her hand as she pointed to a new star system, a bright, glittering hub of commerce and culture. "The archive was their mind," she whispered, her voice filled with the cold fire of fanaticism. "Now we will go for their heart." Reese looked at the target, a system called Meridian, a bustling trade hub home to nearly 1 billion souls, representing 24 species. It was the shining jewel of the consortium's outer territories, a symbol of their prosperous, forward-looking peace. "Kalen, no," he said, his voice low with dread. "That's not a strategic target. It's a metropolis. Using the cacophony there, it would be a massacre. We can't." Kalen's gaze was fixed on the shimmering star. "They built their paradise over our graveyard. Reese, it is time we showed them the bones beneath the floorboards. We will not fire a single shot. We will not break a single law of their precious, civilized warfare. We will simply make them listen, and they will tear their own paradise down with their bare hands." She turned to face him fully, and, for the first time, Reese saw not a leader or a zealot, but something far more terrifying. He saw a ghost wearing human skin, a woman so utterly consumed by the pain of the past that she had no room left for a future. "Prepare the choir," she commanded. "It is time for Meridian to hear the good word." The journey to Meridian was not measured in distance, but in degrees of silence. Aboard the Elegy, a quiet schism had formed, a canyon of unspoken ideology that divided the ship's soul. On one side were the Scriveners, Kalen, their silent queen, who spent the transit time in deep communion, their bodies still in their thrones, their minds wandering the echoing ruins of their ancestors' agony. They were honing their instruments, preparing their souls to become conduits for a pain that could unmake a civilization. They did not speak of their destination. They did not need to. The echoes whispered of 1 billion comfortable souls, blissfully ignorant, and the Scriveners' hearts burned with a cold, righteous fury. On the other side were the unburdened, the navigators, the engineers, the life support technicians, the men and women like Reese who kept the great, dark cathedral of the ship alive. They were the children of the Exodus, born in the void, their heritage a story, not a wound. They moved through the corridors with a new tension, their conversations clipped, their glances at the sealed resonance chamber filled with a mixture of awe and profound dread. They saw not a coming judgment, but an impending atrocity. Reese found himself the unwilling center of their quiet rebellion. They came to him in the engine room, amidst the thrum of the Singularity Core, or in the low-gravity hydroponics bay, where the scent of real soil was a defiant anchor to life. "She means to go through with it," a grizzled engineer named Tobin said, his hands stained with conductive gel. "1 billion people, Reese. They have children there. How is this justice?" Reese had no answer that could satisfy them, or himself. He had argued with Kaylin until his voice was raw, but it was like reasoning with a storm. She did not operate on a plane of logic or strategy. She was an avatar of cosmic grief, and grief does not negotiate. "The echoes demand a witness," she had told him, her eyes distant, already half lost in the wailing of the dead. Meridian is the pinnacle of their amnesia. Its peace is an insult to our memory. We will make them witnesses. We will make them understand that their comfort is built upon our ashes. It was the last time they had spoken. Now, he was a navigator charting a course to a massacre he was desperate to prevent. He began to spend his time in the ship's archives, not the grand psychic library of the Scriveners, but the old digital records of the Exodus fleet. He searched for failsafes, for protocols, for anything the first generation of survivors might have put in place to stop their descendants from becoming the monsters they fled. He found nothing. The first survivors had been consumed with one thing running. They had not planned for a future where their children would learn to weaponize their history and turn back to face their tormentors. The mission was absolute to survive and to remember. Kaylin was simply fulfilling the second half of that commandment with a terrifying, literal devotion. Meanwhile, on Consortium Prime, Prefect Valerius had handed the Xylos anomaly to his most effective instrument. His name was Jorik, and his title was Inquisitor of the Memetic Office. Jorik was not a soldier or a spy in the traditional sense. He was a psychic archaeologist, a man who sifted through the detritus of thought itself. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes so pale they seemed translucent, and he moved with a predator's economy of motion. He did not feel emotions. He cataloged them as potential threats. Valerius had given him the raw, fragmented data from the minds of the Xylo survivors, the few who had not killed themselves or been mercifully euthanized. Jorik sat for 3 days in a sensory deprivation tank, the data flowing directly into his modified cortex, allowing the edges of the cacophony to wash over him, where others found madness. Jorik found patterns. It is not a traditional psionic attack. Jorik reported to Valerius in the sterile white of the panopticon. His voice was a dry rasp, like sand shifting over bone. A telepathic assault is an intrusion, an alien thought forced upon a native mind. This was a replacement. The victim's own consciousness was not attacked. It was completely, utterly submerged, drowned in a sea of manufactured, weaponized experience. Valerius watched the data stream, his face impassive. "Humanity," he stated, not as a question, but as a conclusion. "Extinction event 734. Affirmative." Jorik said, "The memetic signatures are a match for the few fragmented psychic records we have from their final conflict. But the scale is impossible. It is not an echo. It is the entire event, perfectly preserved and amplified. A psychic ghost of an entire species, weaponized. He stepped closer to the holographic display. It is a weapon born of pure trauma. It bypasses conventional shielding because it doesn't target technology. It targets the capacity for empathy. The more compassionate a species, the more susceptible they are. It finds the hooks of pity, of fear, of sorrow in a mind and uses those emotions to pull the whole consciousness under. A flicker of something that might have been distaste crossed Valerius's face. A disease of sentiment. How primitive. It is also a beacon. Yorick continued. An event of this magnitude leaves a residue, a psychic aftershock that propagates through subspace. Faint, but detectable. We cannot track their ship, but we can follow the trail of their grief. I have requisitioned the silent Vigil and a full complement of my acolytes. We will hunt this ghost. Valerius gave a single, sharp nod. Do so. Find the source and map its capabilities. Do not destroy it. I want to understand it. Any weapon that can pacify a world without damaging its infrastructure is a resource to be studied. Yorick bowed his head slightly. And the broadcasters themselves, they are the carriers of the plague, Valerius said, his voice dropping to a near whisper of pure, cold pragmatism. Once you have the sample, sterilize the source. On the vibrant, multi-tiered cityscape of Meridian, junior peacekeeper Taya worked her beat in the grand concourse of the Azure Ring. Her job was less about enforcing laws and more about managing flow. 1,000 different species mingled here, lumbering. Silicon-based gneiss traders haggling with diminutive, insectoid Cathar artisans, sleek, avian Signians preening in the simulated sunlight, while gelatinous oculoids floated serenely through the crowds. The air was a rich tapestry of 1,000 different languages, the scent of alien food stalls, and the faint, clean tang of recycled air. Taya loved it. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly peaceful. This was the consortium's promise made real order from chaos, prosperity from diversity. That day, however, something was off. It began as a feeling, a faint, prickling anxiety at the base of her skull. The noise of the concourse seemed to have a strange, underlying harmony, a low thrum that she couldn't quite place. She saw a Cathar artisan drop a delicate crystal sculpture, chittering in distress, its multifaceted eyes swiveling nervously. A few minutes later, a nice trader abruptly ended a negotiation, complaining of a sudden, crushing headache. Taya keyed her wristcom. Central, are we getting any atmospheric or environmental alerts for Azure Ring? Negative Veritas Peacekeeper, the disembodied voice replied. All levels are green. Why? I don't know, Taya admitted, scanning the crowd. More people were showing signs of discomfort. An oculoid had turned a murky, distressed gray, and a Signian suddenly shrieked and flew into the ceiling struts, flapping in terror at something only it could see. Just a bad feeling. The feeling grew worse. The air seemed to grow thick, heavy with an unspoken sorrow. Taya felt a wave of inexplicable grief wash over her, a profound sense of loss for someone she had never known. She shook her head, trying to clear it. It was like listening to a sad song on a frequency only her bones could hear. Across the concourse, the collective mood was shifting from unease to outright panic. Arguments broke out for no reason. A quiet weeping started in one corner and spread through the crowd like a contagion. The beautiful, chaotic peace of Meridian was beginning to fray at the edges, and Taya had no idea why. aboard the Elegy, hanging like a dagger in the system's outer darkness. Kalen stood before the main observation window, watching the distant, glittering jewel of Meridian. The ship had just finished deploying its payload 10,000 resonance drones, each no bigger than a grain of sand, spread throughout the system's communication and energy networks. They were invisible, undetectable seeds that would now act as amplifiers, turning the entire system into a psychic resonating chamber for the choir's song. Reese stood beside her, his face a mask of grim resolve. He had made his choice. "This is the last chance. Kalen," he pleaded, his voice low. "We can turn back. We made our point at Xylos. The consortium knows we exist. They know the truth now. This is just slaughter." Kalen did not turn. Her reflection in the star-dusted window was superimposed over the unsuspecting world. "Truth is not a point to be made, Reese. It is an experience to be shared. They have not yet felt it. They have only read the reports. They will feel it now. They will all feel it." She turned and walked toward the resonance chamber, her black robes flowing behind her. "It is time. The dead are waiting." Reese watched her go, a cold certainty hardening in his gut. He had known she wouldn't listen. As the inner door to the chamber hissed shut, he turned to his own navigation console. During the deployment of the resonance drones, he had done the unthinkable. On one of the drones, Drone 74 Alpha, he had overridden its stealth protocols and activated a simple, antiquated subspace beacon. It was a crude, noisy signal, the technological equivalent of a scream in the dark. The consortium would almost certainly detect it. They would know the Elegy's exact position. He was inviting the wolf to the door, hoping it would devour the shepherd before she could slaughter the flock. It was treason. It was a betrayal of everything the Exodus fleet had stood for, and it was the only moral choice he had left. He sent one final loose encrypted burst transmission along with the beacon's activation, a message aimed at any consortium ship that might be listening, a plea and a warning. Source of mimetic attack is ship class Elegy. Weapon is psionic, empathy-based. Survivors of Event 734, cease your forgetting. They will not stop. God help us all." He then erased the logs and stood up, his face pale. He had just sentenced his own people, his only home, to probable death at the hands of the consortium. He had betrayed his leader and his history, but as the first terrible wave of the cacophony began to build in the ship's core, a low, keening hum that vibrated through the deck plates, he knew he had made the right choice. In the resonance chamber, Kalen lowered herself into the throne. The filaments snaked out and kissed her skin. The choir of Scriveners followed her lead. She closed her eyes, opening her mind to the great, screaming void. "Let them hear us," she commanded the ghosts of Earth. "Let them hear every broken word, every last breath. Let them drown in our memory." And across the Meridian system, a billion souls looked up at the sky as a wave of pure, undiluted agony descended upon them, a psychic firestorm that burned not the body, but the soul. And in the cold, distant void, a single, lonely beacon began to scream. On the bridge of the silent Vigil, a red light flashed on Inquisitor Jorik's console. "Sir," an acolyte reported, his voice sharp with surprise. "Subspace beacon, broadcasting from the Meridian system. It's crude, but it's a direct triangulation, and we are receiving a data burst." Jorik's pale eyes narrowed as he read Reese's desperate message. A slow, chilling smile touched his lips. The hunt was over. The sterilization could begin. The sound of a billion minds breaking was not a scream. It was a symphony. From her throne at the heart of the elegy, Kaylin was the conductor, and the echoes were her orchestra. Through the psychic feedback of the resonance drones, she felt Meridian shatter. She felt the moment a Cygnon pilot, overwhelmed by the memory of burning skies, flew his cargo hauler into a residential spire. She felt Ignice philosopher, his mind flooded with the terror of a child in a collapsing school, smash his own silicon head against his meditation stone until he was nothing but gravel and dust. She felt the collective consciousness of the oculoids simply dissolve, their serene communal mind unable to process the sheer, selfish agony of individual human death. The city was a canvas, and she was painting it with the colors of Armageddon. Peacekeeper Taya was on the ground when the symphony reached its crescendo. The initial wave of sorrow and panic had been a prelude. This was the opera. She drew her stun baton, a useless gesture against an enemy she couldn't see. The air in the grand concourse shimmered, not with heat, but with psychic pressure. A Cathar merchant suddenly shrieked, its high-pitched cries a perfect echo of a human mother wailing over a dead child. It turned on its own clutch of larvae, stomping them into pulp with its chitinous legs, reenacting a forgotten atrocity from a world it had never known. Taya raised her baton, but her arm froze. Her own mind was being invaded. She saw a flash of a green field under a blue sky, a memory so alien and beautiful it made her ache. Then the sky turned orange, and the field was gone, replaced by a crater of black glass. The memory wasn't just a vision, it was a feeling. The phantom pain of radiation burns bloomed across her skin. The ghost of a lost love, a man named Marcus, whispered in her ear. She had never known a Marcus. Taya fell to her knees, her training, her identity, her very sense of self dissolving under the acid of another's history. She saw her hands, but they were not hers. They were larger, calloused, clutching a rifle in a muddy trench. She was a soldier. She was dying, and she was terrified. All around her, the beautiful, ordered chaos of Meridian had become just chaos. Species turned on species, driven by the phantom hatreds of a long-dead race. The piece that had been Meridian's pride was revealed to be a fragile veneer, easily scraped away by a sufficiently sharp memory. The beacon is a trap. Kaylin's voice, amplified by the resonance chamber, echoed through the elegy. She had felt it the moment Reese activated it, a crude, clumsy shout in the elegant silence of her symphony. She had let him do it. His betrayal was a discordant note, but one she could incorporate into her masterpiece. They are coming. In the ship's engine room, Tobin and a handful of other unburdened had barricaded the door. They had heard Reese's final and desperate act over a jury-rigged comm channel. They were traitors, all of them, but they were traitors with a conscience. "The consortium will destroy us," a young navigator whispered, her face pale. Tobin shook his head, his knuckles white as he gripped a heavy wrench. "Maybe, but they'll stop her. That's all that matters now." Reese stood alone on the navigation deck, watching a single ominous icon appear on the long-range display. It was a Consortium Inquisitor-class vessel, a ship designed not for war, but for extermination. The Silent Vigil. It was moving at an impossible speed, tearing through subspace on a direct intercept course. He had invited the executioner. He could only pray the executioner would be satisfied with one head. Inquisitor Yorick stood on the bridge of the silent Vigil. The ship was a stark, brutalist piece of engineering, all sharp angles and matte black plating, designed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. His acolytes, robed in silent figures with polished silver masks, moved with unnerving synchronicity at their stations. They were all psychic blanks, their minds surgically and chemically cauterized to be immune to the very mimetic weapons they hunted. They were scalpels in the dark. "We have arrived," an acolyte announced, his voice flat and metallic through his mask. "The target vessel, Class Elegy, is holding a stationary position. They are still broadcasting the psionic event." On the main view screen, the Elegy hung in the void, a dark, graceful ship that looked more like a cathedral than a warship. Around it, the system of Meridian was a Jackson Pollock of chaos. Sprawling cityscapes were scarred with fires. Orbital stations were tumbling out of their designated paths. A billion distress signals shrieked in a chorus of technological panic. Yorick felt nothing. He saw only a problem and its solution. "The beacon that guided us here," Yorick mused, his pale eyes fixed on the Elegy. It contained a message, a plea. "It seems there is a schism within the Plague-Bearers. A fascinating development. It suggests they are not a monolith. It suggests they can be broken." He turned to his communications acolyte. "Open a channel to the Elegy. Unencrypted. General broadcast." A moment later, Jorik's amplified voice crossed the void. It was not the voice of a soldier or a diplomat. It was the calm, patient voice of a physician addressing a particularly virulent microbe. "This is Inquisitor Jorik of the Consortium Mimetic Office. You are the source of an unauthorized and catastrophically hostile mimetic broadcast. You have been classified as a Class 1 ideological contagion. Cease your broadcast. Power down your systems. Prepare to be boarded for sterilization." Aboard the Elegy, Reese heard the broadcast. Sterilization. The word was so clean, so clinical. It was the Consortium's way. They didn't murder, they cleansed. They didn't conquer, they pacified. His desperate gamble had failed. He hadn't summoned a negotiator, he had summoned a priest of oblivion. Then, to his astonishment, Kalen's voice came over the general comm, cutting through Yorick's ultimatum. Her voice was no longer just her own. It was layered, resonant with the whispers of the dead, a chorus of ghosts speaking through a single throat. "We are the memory you buried. We are the ghosts from the mass grave you call history. You cannot sterilize a memory. Inquisitor, you can only bear witness." Jorix allowed himself another of his rare, cold smiles. "So, the microbe wishes to negotiate its symptoms. Very well. Let us converse." He nodded to his tactical acolyte. "Deploy the null field." The silent Vigil did not fire a weapon. Instead, a series of pylons extended from its hull, and a shimmering, almost invisible wave of energy expanded outwards, enveloping the Elegy. It was not a shield. It was a psychic anesthetic. On the Elegy, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. For the unburdened, it was like sudden, profound deafness of the soul. The low, background hum of the ship's psychic core, a presence they had lived with their entire lives, vanished. The silence was jarring, terrifying. But for the Scriveners, it was infinitely worse. In the resonance chamber, The flow of the echoes was severed. It was as if the artery connecting Kalen to the ghosts of humanity had been clamped shut. The symphony of a billion dying souls cut out mid-scream. The sudden absence of that all-consuming pain was a new kind of agony. It left a vacuum in its wake, a void in her mind so complete, so absolute, that her own consciousness rushed in to fill it, and she found it wanting. Kalen gasped, her eyes flying open. They were her eyes again, pale gray and wide with shock. The filaments went cold and fell from her skin. She was just a woman in a chair, in a silent room. For the first time in her life, she was alone in her own head, and the quiet was unbearable. She stumbled out of her throne, looking at the other Scriveners. They were stirring, moaning, clutching their heads. Some were weeping, not from psychic pain, but from its absence. They were like addicts cut off from their drug of choice. Their faith, their purpose, their entire identity was built on the foundation of the echoes. Without them, they were just people, broken people. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice small, stripped of its spectral authority. Jorik's voice filled the silence of the bridge. "I have introduced a moment of clarity into your madness. The null field dampens all higher-order psionic activity. Your choir can no longer sing. You are cut off from your inspiration. Now, we will talk. Or, rather, I will talk, and you will listen." Reese felt the null field wash over him as a wave of profound relief. The oppressive, sorrowful weight that had saturated the ship was gone. He could think clearly for the first time in weeks. He raced from the navigation deck, heading for the resonance chamber. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to face her. He found the Scriveners in disarray, a flock without its shepherd. And, in the center of the chamber, Kalen stood, looking lost, diminished. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Reese," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The voices, they're gone." "I know," he said softly, stepping toward her. "It's over." "Kalen." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not a zealot, but the terrified descendant of a murdered people, a woman who had wrapped herself in their pain because it was the only inheritance she had. "He called us a contagion," she murmured. "He thinks our memory is a disease." "Then prove him wrong," Reese urged, his voice intense. "Show him we are more than our pain. We are survivors. We can build something new. We don't have to be defined by our end." Before Kalen could answer, Jorik's voice returned, laced with a chilling, academic curiosity. "Your vessel is fascinating. The psionic resonance of its hull materials is unique, built from the very asteroids that witnessed your planet's death. I presume a clever, if sentimental, piece of engineering. A tomb that sails the stars." A new icon appeared on the Elegy's tactical display. A single boarding craft was detaching from the silent Vigil. "I am sending a team to collect a sample of your historical archives." Jorik's voice continued. "They will not harm you, provided you do not interfere. My acolytes are immune to your affliction. They feel nothing. They are perfect instruments of a clean, quiet, and orderly universe." The boarding craft approached, a sleek, black dart against the backdrop of the dying city of Meridian. Reese looked at Kalen. Her face was hardening again, the brief moment of vulnerability passing, replaced by a familiar, cold fire. "He wants to catalog us," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He wants to put our ghosts in a jar, label them, and file them away in his archives of forgetting." She turned and looked at the central dais of the resonance chamber, at the master control throne. The null field had dampened the echoes, but it hadn't destroyed them. They were still there. A great, silent ocean of potential energy, waiting for a current. "He thinks he can cut us off from our power," she whispered. "He doesn't understand. The echoes are not our power. They are our blood. And you can't stop a heart from beating just by plugging the ears." She strode back to the throne. Her purpose reignited. "Reese," she commanded, her voice once again the voice of the Scrivener. "Prepare to overload the Singularity Core. Route all primary power to the resonance coils. We are going to show the Inquisitor what it truly means to remember." Reese stared at her, horrified. "Kaelin, that will destroy the ship. It will destroy us all." "Yes," she said, her hand hovering over the main power conduit. "But the last thing this consortium will ever hear will be our name." She was going to turn the elegy into a psychic bomb, a final and suicidal scream that would not just cripple the silent Vigil, but would likely burn the memory of humanity into the mind of every living thing in the system. A permanent, psychic scar on the face of the galaxy. It was not justice. It was not revenge. It was apotheosis, and Reese knew, with a sickening certainty, that he could not stop her. The boarding craft of the silent Vigil was a stiletto of polished obsidian, a sliver of the greater void it moved through. It docked with the elegy, not with a clang of magnetic clamps, but with a soft, predatory hiss, its airlock extending like a serpent's fang to pierce the hull. Inside, a dozen of Jorik's acolytes stood in perfect, unnerving stillness. They were specters in silver masks and black robes, their psychic blankness a palpable aura of nothingness. They carried no visible weapons, only sleek, cylindrical devices that hummed with a low, contained energy. They were not soldiers. They were specimen collectors. The inner airlock of the elegy opened, and the acolytes glided into the corridor. The ship was eerily quiet, the emergency lighting casting long, dancing shadows. There was no resistance, no alarms, just the profound, unnerving silence imposed by the null field. Their leader, designated Acolyte Primus, raised a hand, and the squad moved forward with a chilling, synchronized grace. Their mission was simple: penetrate to the core of the ship, retrieve a sample of the psionic source, a Scrivener, alive or dead. It didn't matter, and extract. Jorik wanted a piece of the ghost to dissect. In the resonance chamber, Kaelin's hand trembled over the conduit that would turn her ship and her people into the galaxy's most tragic memory. Her face was a mask of ecstatic, suicidal resolve. This was the ultimate communion, the final, perfect act of remembrance. They would not be forgotten. They would become the pain in the heart of all things. But Reese, standing a few feet away, saw not a prophet, but a woman about to murder everyone he had ever known for the sake of a beautiful, terrible idea. He would not let her. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He stepped between her and the throne. "We are not an ending. Kaelin, we are a beginning. We survived. That has to mean more than just becoming a better weapon." Kaelin looked at him, her eyes burning with the fire of 1 billion dying suns. They are here to put us in a cage, Reese, to label our agony and file it away. I will not be a specimen in their museum of extinct species. Then we fight them, Reese countered, his mind racing. Not as ghosts, but as men and women. We have a ship. We have people. Tobin and the others, they're still fighting. They barricaded themselves in the engine room. They haven't given up. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Kaylin's face. The null field had done more than ever her connection to the echoes. It had reintroduced the unfamiliar calculus of choice. When the voices screamed, the path was always clear. In the silence, there were options, and options created doubt. Before she could decide, the doors to the resonance chamber slid open. But it was not the acolytes who stood there. It was Tobin, his face smudged with grease, flanked by a dozen engineers armed with plasma cutters, rivet guns, and heavy-duty wrenches. They looked terrified, but resolute. We cut the primary power feeds to the outer hull, Tobin said, his voice rough. The boarders are trapped in Corridor Gamma. But we've also lost life support in that sector. They'll run out of air in 20 minutes. So will we, if we don't get the main reactor back online. He looked from Reese to Kaylin, his gaze settling on her. This is our ship, our home. Are you going to let some silver-faced ghoul take it from us? Or are you going to help us fight for it, on the bridge of the silent Vigil? Yorick watched the internal schematics of the elegy on his view screen. He saw the power fluctuations, the sealed bulkheads. They are resisting, he noted, a hint of academic interest in his dry voice. Crude, but spirited. Acolyte Primus, what is your status? We are encountering unexpected internal resistance. The acolyte's metallic voice returned. The ship is compartmentalizing. Life support in our sector is failing. We can breach the bulkheads, but it will take time. You have 17 minutes. Yorick replied calmly. I am less interested in their ship than in the contents of their minds. Proceed. He leaned back in his command chair, steepling his long, thin fingers. The resistance was a new data point. The mimetic weapon was one of total psychological dominance, yet its wielders were resorting to base mechanical tactics. It was a contradiction, and Jorik loathed contradictions. He wanted to understand the mind that could command such a terrible power, but would also stoop to locking a door. The choice was made. Kaylin looked at the determined, grease-stained faces of her crew. The unburdened she had so often dismissed as being deaf to the great song of the past. But they were not deaf. They were simply listening to a different song, the song of survival. The acolytes are psychic blanks, she said, her voice clear and focused, the prophet giving way to the strategist. The cacophony will not affect them, but the null field generator on their ship, that is their strength. And their weakness. She turned to Reese. Can you get a sensor lock on the null field pylons? Reese was already at a secondary console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. They're exposed. No shielding. They never expected a conventional attack. But our weapons systems are still offline, throttled by the field. We don't need our weapons, Kaylin said, a grim smile touching her lips. She looked at Tobin. We need your engines. A plan, desperate and perhaps suicidal, was born in the silent heart of the crippled ship. It was a plan built not on psychic power, but on physics and fury. The acolytes, using a focused plasma torch, breached the first bulkhead, the molten metal hissing in the thinning atmosphere. They moved into the next corridor, a long, straight maintenance artery that led toward the ship's core. The silence was absolute. There were no defenders. It felt wrong. Acolyte Primus paused, his silver mask scanning the empty passage. Something was illogical. Reese worked with a frantic, focused energy, bypassing dozens of safety protocols. "The Singularity Core is unstable," he shouted over the comm link to Tobin in the engine room. "I'm routing every joule of power we have into the primary thruster. It's not meant to handle this kind of energy transfer." "Just tell us when," Tobin yelled back over the scream of the overloading engines. Kaylin stood on the small auxiliary bridge overlooking the resonance chamber, her hands gripping the railing. She had closed her eyes, not to connect with the echoes, but to remember the ship's design, to feel its structure as an extension of her own body. This vessel, born of the asteroid that had witnessed Earth's death, was about to become its avenging angel. "They are in the main conduit," she said, her voice broadcast to Reese and Tobin. "They are halfway to the core." On the silent vigil, Jorik watched the Elegy's energy signature spike to impossible levels. "What are they doing?" he murmured. "They are turning their entire ship into a projectile, a primitive, inefficient, and utterly futile gesture." He felt a flicker of something that, in a lesser being, might have been disappointment. He had hoped for a more elegant, intellectual opponent. "Target their engines," he commanded. "Disable them." The silent Vigil's turbolaser batteries swiveled, charging with lethal energy. But they were too late. "Now!" Kaylin screamed. Reese slammed his hand down on the activation panel. In the engine room, Tobin and his crew braced themselves as the Elegy's main thruster ignited with the force of a small star. The ship, all 10 kilometers of it, did not accelerate. It leapt. It spun on its axis, a ballerina of death, not to flee, but to attack. The massive main engine, now a white-hot spear of pure energy, swung around to face the silent Vigil. Inside the maintenance corridor, the acolytes were incinerated before they could register their own destruction. The blast from the thruster, focused and absolute, tore through the ship's own superstructure, a self-inflicted wound of unimaginable violence. But its target was not the acolytes. Its target was the null field, the raw, unshielded energy of the Singularity Core, channeled through the thruster, slammed into the pylons on Jorik's ship. For a moment, the two forces, psychic anesthetic and raw power, warred against each other. Then, with a flash of light that outshone the distant sun, the null field collapsed. The effect on the Elegy was immediate. The echoes came rushing back. The silence that had filled Kaylin's mind was shattered by the triumphant, vengeful roar of 10 billion ghosts, freed from their cage. The power of their return was so great that it didn't just fill the Scriveners. It spilled out, washing over every member of the crew. Tobin, in the engine room, cried out and staggered back, his mind filled with the phantom smell of burning cities. On the auxiliary bridge, Reese gripped his console, his knuckles white as the raw, unfiltered grief of a murdered world poured into him. For the first time, he felt it as Kaylin did not as a story, but as a living, breathing wound. He understood. Oh God, he finally understood. Kaylin, however, did not scream. She opened herself to the torrent, embracing it, her body arching in the familiar agony and ecstasy of full communion. But this time, it was different. In the brief, clarifying silence of the null field, she had seen her crew. She had seen their courage, their defiance. The echoes were no longer just a weapon of pure, nihilistic grief. They were now alloyed with something new, the fierce, desperate will to live of the unburdened. The song had changed. It was no longer just a lament. It was a war cry. On the bridge of the silent vigil, alarms blared. Jorek stood unfazed amidst the chaos as his ship reeled from the impact. The null field was gone. His acolytes were gone, and something new was washing over his vessel. It was not the unfocused and chaotic agony of the Meridian broadcast. This was a focused, coherent, and utterly malevolent wave of psionic energy. The bridge of the silent vigil flickered, and, for a moment, the sterile black interior was replaced by a burning landscape under a blood-red sky. Jorek's remaining crew, their psychic conditioning never meant to withstand a direct, focused assault of this magnitude, began to scream. One acolyte clawed off his silver mask, revealing a face contorted in a rictus of pure terror, his eyes staring at horrors only he could see. Another simply went rigid and collapsed, his mind wiped clean. Jorek stood alone, his own formidable psychic defenses straining against the tide. He felt the edges of the broadcast, the raw emotion of it. It was hatred, pure and distilled, the hatred of the victim for the abuser, of the forgotten for the forgetful. It was a force of nature. And for the first time in his life, Inquisitor Jorek felt a flicker of an emotion he could not catalog. It might have been fear. "You wanted a sample. Inquisitor." Kalen's voice echoed in his mind, no longer a chorus, but a single, focused point of infinite pressure. "Have it all." The elegy, mortally wounded, its back half a molten ruin, drifted. But its choir was singing again. And this time, they were singing directly for an audience of one. The psychic assault intensified, focusing entirely on the silent vigil. Jorek felt his consciousness begin to fray. He saw flashes, a child's face, a lover's touch, a soldier's death. He was being force-fed a lifetime of human experience in a matter of seconds. His own identity, the cold, logical construct he had built over decades, was beginning to dissolve. With the last of his will, he opened a channel to Consortium Prime, his voice a strained, ragged thing. "Prefect, the contagion. It adapts. It learns." He looked at his own hands, but saw the hands of a stranger covered in blood. Requesting exterminatus protocol." He collapsed to his knees, his mind no longer his own. He was a boy named Sam, hiding in a subway tunnel as the world ended above, and he was weeping. He was finally, truly, feeling. And it was destroying him. The last command of Inquisitor Jorek, a desperate, gargled plea for exterminatus, hung in the void like a curse. On Consortium Prime, Prefect Valerius received the message in the cold, sterile silence of the Panopticon. He watched the final data stream from the silent vigil, the ship's life support failing, its systems going haywire, and a single, repeating, psychic waveform of pure, weaponized terror. The Inquisitor, his finest instrument, had been broken. Valerius felt nothing, no anger, no regret. A tool had served its purpose and failed. It was time for a new tool, Exterminatus was the consortium's final or unspoken sanction. It was not a battle plan. It was a statement of cosmic hygiene. It meant the complete and utter obliteration of a star system, its planets, its moons, its every orbiting speck of dust, using planet cracker warheads and system-wide stellar ignition catalyst. It was the act of erasing a cosmic typo. Valerius, without hesitation, authorized it. A fleet of black, unmarked warships, the consortium's hidden fist, began to move from their secret berths in the deep void. They had one destination, Meridian. They would not just destroy the elegy. They would burn the entire system to ensure not a single echo of its ghost song remained. The price of forgetting was about to be paid in fire. Aboard the crippled elegy, a fragile, exhausted peace had settled. The choir had fallen silent, the scriveners slumping in their thrones, their minds and bodies spent from the focused, final assault on Yorick. The echoes were still there, a soft, sorrowful hum now, their rage sated for the moment. Kaelin stood on the auxiliary bridge, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the communion. She was alive. They were all alive. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling. Rhys came to stand beside her, his face pale, but his eyes clear. He, like all the unburdened, had been touched by the echoes in that final blast. He had not been drowned by them, but he had been baptized in their sorrow. He no longer saw Kaelin as a fanatic, but as the keeper of a terrible, necessary wound. "The silent Vigil is dead in the water," he said, his voice hoarse. "No life signs, no power. We won." Kaelin looked out at the silent, black ship of the Inquisitor. "No," she said softly. "We survived. There's a difference." Her eyes then fell upon the planet Meridian. The cacophony had ceased, but the damage was done. The city was a patchwork of fire and silence. They had proven their point. They had made the consortium listen, but the cost was 1 billion shattered lives. A cold knot of something unfamiliar tightened in her chest. It was not grief for her own dead, but for the dead she had just made. It was guilt. The moment of introspection was shattered by a proximity alert, a shrill, desperate cry from the ship's few remaining functional sensors. "Multiple subspace ruptures," Rhys yelled, stumbling toward his console. "Massive energy signatures. They're, oh, gods." On the view screen, a dozen new contacts appeared. They were huge, angular, and utterly black, ships that seemed to drink the light around them. They bore no consortium markings, but their intent was unmistakable. The Exterminatus fleet had arrived. One of the black ships launched a volley of objects. They weren't torpedoes. They were planet crackers. Massive, self-propelled drills designed to burrow into a planet's core and detonate its mantle. "They're not targeting us," Rhys whispered in horror, watching the warheads streak toward the unsuspecting, crippled world of Meridian. "They're sterilizing the entire system." Kaelin stared, her mind reeling. She had wanted to make them remember. She had wanted to force them to confront the truth of their own history. Instead, she had simply given them a new atrocity to bury. They weren't going to learn from the past. They were going to obliterate it, starting with her. "They won't let the story be told," she murmured, a chilling understanding dawning in her eyes. They would rather burn a galaxy than admit they were wrong. The choice was stark, immediate, and absolute. They could run. The Elegy's engines were damaged, but Tobin was already working miracles in the molten ruin of the engineering deck. They might be able to limp into subspace and escape, or they could stay. They could fight. It would be suicide. But as she looked at the silent, grieving faces of her scriveners and the grime-streaked, defiant faces of the unburdened, Kaelin knew there was no choice. They had not come this far only to become another ghost. "Rhys," she said, her voice imbued with a calm, terrible finality. "Open a channel. All frequencies. System-wide. Unencrypted." Rhys looked at her, his eyes wide. He knew what she was about to do. He nodded slowly and complied. Across the Meridian system, on every ship, every functioning terminal, every emergency comm unit on the dying planet, a voice spoke. It was Kaelin's voice, clear and strong, stripped of its ghostly echoes, but filled with the weight of 3 centuries of sorrow. "My name is Kaelin. I am a scrivener of the Last Testament of Earth. We came here not to conquer, but to remind. The civilization you live in, the peace you cherish, was built on the silent grave of my people. We did not die. We were erased." As she spoke, the elegy began to move, not away from the fleet, but toward it. It was a wounded animal turning to face the hunters. "We used our pain as a weapon to make you listen. We were wrong. Pain does not teach. It only scars. But now, your leaders have sent their final answer. They have sent their executioners, not just for us, but for all of you. They will not allow a single witness to our story to survive. They will burn this world, and then they will redact the ashes." Aboard the lead exterminator vessel, Admiral Vorlag, a man whose soul had been surgically replaced with a copy of the consortium's Articles of Incorporation, watched the crippled ship advance. "Arrogant pest," he grunted. "Target their reactor core. End this." But as his weapons officer tried to comply, something happened. The elegy began to glow. It started as a soft, ethereal light, and then it grew, an intense, silver radiance that pulsed with an impossible energy. In the resonance chamber, Kaelin had returned to her throne, but she was not alone. Every scrivener, every engineer, every navigator, every last soul on the elegy had gathered around her. Tobin stood beside Rhys, their hands on the control consoles, while the scriveners laid their hands on the throne itself. They were no longer 2 factions. They were one choir. "She's linking all of us." Rhys breathed, feeling the consciousness of every person on the ship merge with his own. He felt Tobin's grim determination, a young scrivener's terrified faith, and at the center of it all, Kaelin's vast, ancient grief, now tempered by a fierce, protective love for the people beside her. They were not channeling the echoes of the dead anymore. They were channeling themselves, the living. Kaelin's voice continued its broadcast, now amplified by the collective psychic energy of her entire crew, a beacon of pure, defiant life. "You cannot erase a truth. You cannot burn a memory. A story, once told, can never be untold. We are that story. We are humanity, and we remember." The elegy did not fire a weapon. Instead, it unleashed its final song. It was not the cacophony of rage and pain. It was something new. It was a wave of pure, unshielded truth. It was the memory of Earth, not just its violent end, but its entire, glorious, messy history. It was the love of a mother for her child, the courage of a scientist reaching for the stars, the quiet joy of a farmer watching a sunrise, the bitter sorrow of a soldier dying for a cause he no longer believed in. It was 1,000,000,000 lifetimes, 1,000,000,000,000 experiences unleashed in a single, coherent, undeniable wave of shared consciousness. The wave washed over the Exterminatus fleet. It bypassed their shields, their hardened systems, their military discipline. It went straight for their minds. Admiral Vorlog cried out, clutching his head as his mind was filled with the memory of a first kiss under a sky with a single yellow sun. His weapons officer collapsed, sobbing, overwhelmed by the sudden, profound understanding of the symphony he was hearing in his head, a piece of music composed by a man named Beethoven. The fleet, an instrument of perfect, sterile violence, faltered. Pilots veered off course, their hands refusing to fire on a people whose lives they were now experiencing as their own. The planet crackers, their guidance systems disrupted by the psychic wave, went spiraling off into the void. The Exterminatus had failed, broken not by a weapon, but by an idea called empathy. But the effort was too much. The elegy, its singularity core and its psychic core, fused in one finalist glorious act, began to break apart. Alarms shrieked a final, dying lament. Kalen Reese shouted. As the bridge around them buckled, Kalen smiled. A single, perfect tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. The light from the ship's core enveloped her and in her mind. For the first time, the screams of the dead were silent. They had been heard. They were at peace. The elegy detonated, not in a blast of fire and fury, but in a silent, expanding sphere of pure, silver light. A light that carried a story, a light that touched every world in the system and beyond. In the weeks and months that followed, the consortium fractured. The story of the elegy carried on the psychic shockwave of its final act could not be contained. It became a legend, a myth, a rebellion. Worlds on the fringe, hearing the tale of the civilization that was erased, began to question their own managed histories. The Exterminatus fleet, its crews driven half mad by the sudden burden of a soul, mutinied and vanished into the lawless outer territories. Prefect Valerius was quietly deposed, his philosophy of forgetting now seen as a dangerous poison. The galaxy did not find peace, but it found memory, and in that memory, it found a new, more difficult, and more honest path. Far out in the dark, on 1,000 different worlds, people would look up at the stars and tell the story of the ghost ship that sang a song of truth, a song so powerful it broke an empire. They would call it the Elegy of Earth. And in the telling, humanity, a species long thought dead, was resurrected, not as a race, but as a memory, a warning, and a promise that even in the deepest silence, a voice, if it is true, can still be heard. And that is a kind of survival that can never be erased.